All right, we've spent a lot of time on sort of the most visible part of the executive branch, which is the president. But as we've mentioned before, right, there's a whole rest of the executive branch that helps the president carry out policy because the president is just one person and he can't enforce every single law by himself. So, the federal bureaucracy are all the agencies and people below the president who are responsible for carrying out policy. So, there's kind of three parts to the federal bureaucracy. So, there's the executive office of the president, and these are all the agencies and staff who directly support and advise the president. There's also the executive departments, which are the 15 departments responsible for overseeing issues such as defense and human services and so on. And the heads of these agencies are called the cabinet, and they also help advise the president on policy. Then there's the independent agencies, which are the other federal agencies that are part of the executive branch but don't belong to any of the executive departments. All right, so here's just a little visual metaphor to help you remember what the bureaucracy is. At the top, the most visible part of the executive branch is the president, right? But beneath him is the entire bureaucracy, and these are all the folks who carry out policy, sometimes kind of invisibly. All right, so as I mentioned, there's three parts, and we're going to go through each one of those in detail. So the first one is the executive office of the presidency. And these are the groups that work to directly support the president and help him carry out his day-to-day work and make major policy decisions. There are also subdivisions to this. So there's the White House office. These are all the staffers who actually work in the White House itself. And there's the office of the vice president. So that's the vice president and then his or her staff. Then there's the National Security Council and the Office of Management and Budget. All right, so second part of the bureaucracy are the executive departments. And these are the groups whose main purpose is to carry out large federal policies passed by Congress. But they also, even though their main purpose is to carry out policy, they also do sort of play a role in making policy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So there is kind of an interplay between the executive departments and Congress. So there are 15 of these agencies. They've been added slowly over time, and they include the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, and then, as we mentioned, there's quite a few more. And so stay tuned to do a little bit of research on these. The heads of these 15 agencies are called the cabinet. So the president appoints these people, but the cabinet members are subject to Senate approval, as is kind of the pattern. And these members, or the members of the cabinet, also help advise the president on key policy issues related to their department. All right, so third piece of the bureaucracy are the independent agencies. So these are all the other agencies that help carry out federal policy that are outside of the executive departments. So there's about 150 of these. There's quite a few. Some of these might be familiar household names: the CIA, NASA, the Post Office, etc. And a lot of these, though not all, have important sort of regulatory roles. So they regulate various industries. So obviously like NASA and the Post Office don't do that, but the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that's an independent agency, the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. There's lots of acronyms today. Get ready for it. All right, so how does the bureaucracy work? So we know their main job is carrying out policy passed by Congress, right? But in doing so, they also make their own policy in a way. So here's how that process works. So step one, Congress passes legislation. Congress actually passes the law. Then the bureaucrats, so the people who work for the bureaucracy, write regulations. So a lot of times Congress's laws are kind of broad and vaguely worded. So the purpose of regulation is to clarify the intent of the law passed by Congress. Now, bureaucrats not only write regulations, they carry out these regulations, and then they punish people and businesses if they do not follow those regulations, right? So in order to kind of make this make more sense to us, let's look at a specific example. All right. So suppose that Congress passes legislation requiring that packaged foods that are sold between states undergo federal inspection to ensure that they are safe for consumers, right? We know Congress is allowed to do this because they're allowed to regulate interstate commerce. So this is part of that. This is technically one of their implied powers, right? They can regulate the products that are being sold across interstate lines, right? But that's pretty vague and broadly worded. So now the responsibility for clarifying that rule and for enforcing it falls to the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So the FDA writes a regulation that states that in order to be considered safe, so they're clarifying what Congress means by that, Packaged chocolate can contain up to 60 insect parts per 100 grams of chocolate, which is real, at least the last time I looked it up. So yes, this is, next time you eat chocolate, think about this. All right, so they are clarifying the intent of Congress's legislation. All right, so how's that enforced? So FDA employees carry out this policy by inspecting chocolate. So there is someone whose whole job it is to go to the Hershey factory and measure the amount of bug parts in that chocolate, right? Now, suppose that a company violates this policy. Hershey decides to include 70 insect parts per 100 gram of chocolate. Delicious. If the company violates this policy, the FDA can enforce the policy. They can issue a recall, so they can say, hey, stop selling that chocolate, don't eat it. Or they can fine that company, right? So force it to pay money, say, hey, stop doing that. All right. So that's how the bureaucracy works. Let's talk about checks on the bureaucracy. And yes, this is a lot to write down, but you're going to write down all of it because it might pop up on a test. Hint. All right, so how can the president check the bureaucracy? And you're like, hold up, there's checks within branches? Yes, there are. So the president can actually limit the power of the bureaucracy, right? Because they are his people. So he can appoint and remove bureaucrats, right? He can issue executive orders changing bureaucratic policy, so he has influence over policy. He can create and abolish executive departments, or he can refuse to give an agency money. So some pretty big themes here, right? Changing the leadership and then changing funding. So Congress actually has some influence over that as well. So Congress is the biggest check on the bureaucracy, right? They're sort of the neutral third party here who's watching over them. So Congress also has control over funding, right? We know that's one of their big checks over the executive branch is the power of the purse. So they can refuse to appropriate money for a bureaucratic agency or program. They can also write legislation that changes the bureaucracy's actions, right? So they can change those regulations through changing legislation. They can also investigate the bureaucracy, right? That's another really important role that they play. And then, of course, right, they have some control over leadership. So the Senate can refuse to confirm the president's appointment to the cabinet.